out there. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Restoring the Sciences webinar series, sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. I'm your host, Scott Turner. I'm director of the Intrusion of Diversity in the Sciences project at the National Association of Scholars. I'm also a retired professor of biology. I'd like to welcome our guest tonight. This is Michael Flannery. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Alabama at Birmingham Libraries. He is a historian by profession and inclination. He's worked extensively on a host of historical topics related to medicine, pharmacy, and most notably in evolutionary biology. He's written extensively on the history of evolution. This is a field that's actually rife with revisionism and Whiggish interpretations of history, and so it's very refreshing to have someone who's prepared to take a fresh look at the history of this subject, as Mike Flannery has done. Included in his works has been a very fine biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, who has been unfairly referred to by many as Darwin's moon. The title of the book is Nature's Prophet, Alfred Russel Wallace and the Evolution from Natural Selection to Natural Theology. This is from the University of Alabama Press. And he takes a very deeply philosophical look at a field that actually styles itself as being somehow beyond philosophy, which is really kind of an intellectually untenable way of looking at it. What we're going to be talking about tonight is the fraught subject of purposefulness in biology and evolution, sometimes referred to by the T word, teleology. We should point out that this is a fraught subject only to modern Darwinism. The idea that evolution is a kind of a machine-driven system is something that's really anomalous in the history of thought of biology, and in fact, it's been a center point of most thinking about biology ever since Aristotle. And welcome, Mike. We're glad to have you here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks for the invitation, Scott. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so just a short bit of housekeeping to our friends in the audience. We're going to go about 45 minutes and in the conversation between the two of us, and then we're going to go to Q&A, which is the most fun part of these webinars, actually. Can I ask you to please put them into the Q&A block? That gives us a number of ways of approaching them. You can vote up or down on the questions that are coming up, and we have the ability to filter them by how controversial they are. But we try to get to as many of the questions as we can in the time that we have allotted. We're nominally on for an hour, but we can sometimes go later than that. Okay, Mike, why don't we start with Alfred Russel Wallace? Why don't you tell us about him and how has he been sort of his very original contributions have been eclipsed by the son of Darwinism, making him into Darwin's moon.
Yes, that's in fact there was actually a biography of Wallace many years ago, literally by that title. So you're quite on spot historiographically with that unfortunate characterization. Let me talk about Wallace this way, and maybe do it a little bit by juxtaposing him by the brilliant son that he's supposedly revolving around, and that's Charles Darwin. So when we think about Wallace, he was born on January the 8th, 1823. So we're coming up on his bicentennial birthday. And he lived until 1913. So he was 14 years younger than Charles Darwin. And then Darwin died, of course, in April of 1882. So Wallace was around a lot longer after Darwin had passed away. But more interestingly, if we kind of look at his resume a little bit, Wallace spent a lot of time investigating the flora and fauna of two major regions. One was South America. The other was the East Asian Maritimes, we call it today. At any rate, he was there from 1848 until 1852 in South America. And then he came back for a couple of years and then went to the Malay Archipelago from 1854 to 1862. So altogether, he had about 12, almost 13 years of what you might say field experience as a naturalist. Darwin, by comparison, he was on the Beagle from December of 1831 until October of 1836. So he had about 5 years. So big imbalance just in that area. Now, this is significant, and I want all of the viewers to bear this in mind. When we compare Darwin's global voyage on the Beagle to Wallace's time in South America and the Malay Archipelago, they were very different. Basically, Wallace followed Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle wherever it went, but he never ventured too far away from it. Wallace, on the other hand, lived and worked in the areas that he was investigating, so he got to know the people intimately. And Wallace became, over time, a pretty good cultural anthropologist. And he was interested in the people, whether they were the natives of South America or the natives on the island of the South Pacific. He was very interested in their culture, in their habits, in their religions, in their artwork, and the like. Whereas you won't get this from Darwin at all. And Darwin was a comparatively poor anthropologist. I mean, when he saw the Fuegians, the natives around Cape Horn, that he was horrified by them. He thought they were like animals and all the rest. At any rate, I think that's largely due to the fact that Darwin didn't live among the people he was investigating and seeing. Whereas Wallace not only got to know these people, he got to speak their languages. And so he was intimately involved. Now, what brings them together? What brings them together was a letter, often regarded as the Ternate letter, because it was supposedly sent by Wallace from the small island of Ternate, and it was titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart from the Original Type." That was sent by Wallace to Darwin in March of 1858, and Darwin said he received it on June 18th. Now, there's a big debate about whether he actually got it then or not, but I'm really not interested in that. We can assume for our purposes that Darwin received it when he said he did. So at that point, Darwin was astonished. He thought this letter was just like his theory of evolution that he had been working on all those many years. And so he got together with Charles Lyell and I think Joseph Hooker, and they decided to unveil it at a hastily called Linnaean Society meeting on July 1st, 1858. And that officially unveiled the theory of evolution for which Darwin would take precedence. And Wallace didn't argue about that. He was perfectly fine with that. He knew Darwin had been working on his theory for some time. And so he was just very pleased and happy to get entree into as notable and as well respected a society as Linnaean Society, which he probably never would have gotten on his own, because Wallace was not highborn. He was a working class fellow who came up from working class, more or less working class beginnings. But if you compare, let's say, Darwin to Wallace in terms of their specimen collecting, which I like to do because it gives you a sense of just the sheer volume of Wallace's collecting compared to Darwin's. And there's a marvelous article by Melinda Fagan in the Journal of the History of Biology called Wallace, Darwin, and the Practice of Natural History. It's a marvelous article I would recommend anyone look at. But Wallace collected over 125,000 specimens in the Malay Archipelago alone. Add to that probably an additional 10,000 specimens in South America. So he, in effect, collected twice. He collected once for himself, and then he collected for his agent, Samuel Stevens, who was back in London, who would sell these specimens to collectors, museums, and the like. So he was making a living literally off of his collecting, but he was also saving it for himself because he was, both a sort of an entrepreneur on the one hand and a scientist on the other. So he's collecting twice. Darwin, by comparison, collected about 5,400 specimens. So you've got about 135,000 specimens that Wallace collected to Darwin. So the differences there are massive. And Melinda Fagan points out that this also belies a difference between Wallace's approach and Darwin's approach, where Darwin would look at every detail of a species. Darwin was more interested in populations, and it affected how their theories would play out. But with all that said, Wallace's most important books, he wrote quite a bit, but I would say his most important books is the Geographical Distribution of Animals, which really launched the field of biogeography. That came out in 1876. A book called Darwinism in 1889. And there, I believe it's chapter 15, where he makes the stunning announcement that natural selection cannot explain the origin of life, sentience in animals, or the special attributes of human beings. Then he wrote a book about cosmic fine-tuning called Man's Place in the Universe that came out in 1903. And then, to my way of thinking, his magnum opus came out in 1910. It was called The World of Life, a Manifestation of Creative Power, Directive Mind, and Ultimate Purpose, which pretty much is the gist of the entire book. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of Alfred Russel Wallace. And from my description, perhaps now the viewers can see why I call him nature's prophet and why I characterize his life as moving from one of natural selection to natural theology.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about Wallace to me is the departure that you just described between he and Darwin, really over the problem of consciousness, of mind. How widespread was it? Because we came through a period where Darwinism has become virtual dogma, and I hasten to add that modern Darwinism is actually quite different from the Darwinism of Darwin himself. But we were always well, when the subject of Wallace's
I'm frozen.
the crazy
Uh-oh.
uncle in the attic, and by which is not only not true, but
Chance? Something
Yes.
breaking up.
Yeah, I think
then
Scott's just frozen.
oh, I've frozen. Oh, okay. Am I back?
Yes, you're back. You
Okay,
appear to
I
be back.
apologize.
Or not. Oh no.
What I
You
was
guys,
saying, am I frozen now?
you were just for the last 10 seconds or so.
Okay. That the issue of Darwin's or Wallace's spiritualism is really kind of a caricature of his thinking. What Wallace was really trying to get at is, as you said, this age-old problem of what's the role of mind, of intentionality, of soul or spirit in not only the existence and the functioning of life, but also in its evolution. And this is somewhat complicated by the fact, of course, that if you look at the classical theories of life, namely the Platonic and the Aristotelian, those were not evolutionary philosophies. In fact, evolution was precluded, and yet, even as through the medieval and Enlightenment periods, it started to dawn on people that there was in fact change. There was in fact transmutationism. This question of mind and purposefulness and teleology, to use that word, has never gone away. It's always Darwinism in its modern form has tried to abolish teleology and abolish purposefulness, but it doesn't really hold up very well. It leads Darwinism into all sorts of crazy philosophical traps. And you wrote a very interesting piece about strong versus weak teleology. Can you help us sort through these issues and how Darwinism really could not escape teleology, purposefulness, even as much as it tried to?
That's true. It can't, and it hasn't, and it won't. To make a long story short, teleology has haunted Darwinism and certainly haunted the neo-Darwinists ever since. What I tried to do, that was an article that came out a couple of years ago, Strong and Weak Teleology in the Life Sciences Post-Darwin. And what I wanted to do was to create, well, first of all, look at teleology in as many aspects as possible, and point out that teleology is not it's not like a toggle switch. It's not either there or not there. There are degrees and there are different teleological perspectives. So you can have weak teleology, then you can have strong teleology, and then, of course, you can have no teleology at all. But it can be also transcendent, in which you see purposefulness pointing to a God or a deity, but it doesn't have to. You can have purposefulness that is not transcendent, but nonetheless sees purposefulness as a meaningful factor in scientific description and explanation. And that's kind of what I was trying to do in that article. In fact, in that article, there's a little schematic where I take different individuals and map them out on the teleological plane. And so, as you might expect, if I think I've got it here somewhere, I can look at it and explain that it shouldn't be surprising If you think of Charles Darwin as being weak teleology, probably, and certainly Thomas Henry Huxley, all of the X-Club founders, John Tyndall, all of those people would be weak teleologists. But then you have non-transcendent teleologists who see the value of purpose in nature, but don't necessarily want to ascribe it to God or a deity. An example there, the creative evolution vitalist theory, Ilan Vital, would be another example. And then, of course, you have strong teleologists. G.K. Chesterton comes to mind. And then even you get in certain strange historical situations. And here's one. Probably the greatest promoter of Darwinism in America was Asa Gray. Asa Gray, the famous Harvard biologist, but he never agreed with Darwin about the teleological aspects of it. He believed that you could take his evolutionary theory and point it toward God. And while they publicly were sort of in agreement, letter after letter privately between them is just them going back and forth over that question, to which, they never really resolve it. So Darwin didn't openly attack Asa Gray's theistic views because Gray was his best promoter in the United States. He wasn't going to kill that cash cow, as it were. And Asa Gray wanted to promote the theory because he thought it was the best science at the time. I'm not so sure Asa Gray would be in the Darwin camp today if he saw what it has become. And when I say what it has become, I mean, to me, personally, I just view very questionable books like those by Daniel Dennett, who talks about Darwin's acid. Well, in a sense, he's right. It is an acid. It does eat through everything. And acid is, by its very nature, destructive. So I don't disagree with Daniel Dennett's thesis. I just don't see any reason to praise it. And then, of course, probably the worst example of all, and I think of the many books that are all too popular by people like Richard Dawkins, who, in many ways, I mean, if you think about his book, and I know I'm sort of going at tangents here, but I think of his book, The Selfish Gene. I think today we've gotten away from that sort of monolithic gene-centric model because there's so many epigenetic factors now that are really transforming. And I think ultimately they're going to dramatically transform evolutionary biology in pretty significant ways. But the point of the teleology article, Strong and Weak, is that it's been, as you had pointed out earlier, a historic feature of evolutionary biology ever since Anaxagoras, by the way, about 500 BC. So it goes way back on up to present. And I give some examples of some pretty well credentialed, noteworthy biologists, like Leconte Dunois, who was a biophysicist in France, who believed in a strong form of teleology. Edmund Ware Sinnott, the famous botanist from Yale. And these are people that are writing after the neo-Darwinian synthesis. They're writing in the late 40s, 50s, and even early 60s. We don't hear about them today because they've been subsumed by a certain narrative that says, in order for it to be science, we can't invite any kind of purpose into the front door or back. And I think so long as science remains fearful of purpose in nature, it's going to have a problem making strides forward. And I think that's been one of the points of your most recent publication, Scott, and you've done a very good job of laying that out.
Thank you.
And there's more work to be done in that field as well.
Yeah, when you say that that it's okay, we're getting away from the kind of narrow focus on gene selection, which is of course characterized by was defended by Dennett, among other things, among other people, and of course Richard Dawkins is the most visible advocate of that. You're right. When I speak to my colleagues, they say, well, yeah, of course there's life is purposeful and there's purpose in evolution, but they always fall back on the kind of weak teleology that you described, namely a kind of operational definition of purpose. The purpose of the heart is to pump blood. Well, of course, that's an obvious thing, and how silly of you to bring up the ways in which Darwinism supposedly doesn't go into purpose. And I sort of I'm guilty of that myself as a kind of weak teleologist. I'm a physiologist, and of course, and I'm very interested in mechanism, and I've been trying to work through this, maybe not so successfully, but there are several things in that paper that I thought were so penetrating. You kind of chide weak teleologists, somewhat like myself, but others as well, for not really grasping what teleology is and what strong teleology is. One of the caricatures is that, if you're a strong teleologist, someone along the lines of Steve Meyer, for example, that you're just using this as a cloak to reintroduce a God into our thinking of evolution, and therefore that's the end of science. But you actually make a very deep point in here, namely that you can't have teleology, you can't have purposefulness unless there's choice involved, some kind of choice. And choice is something that living things do. It's not something that non-living things do. And this means, and you have a quote in there that I thought was very important, namely, teleology, to be meaningful, must be experiential. That is, there must be some kind of a cognitive interaction of life with nature, and built into that, of course, there's some kind of, when you add the element of choice to it, that's a purposeful act right there. And that's something that's inherent in life, and inherent in life in a deep way that evolutionary biologists mostly would reject. And there's just one final quote, and then we can you can elaborate on this. Is that strong teleology is purpose found in order and value conveyed through participation in personal experience. And someone who was reading that would say, oh, you're anthropomorphizing, and therefore that invalidates your argument. But how would you respond to that kind of critique?
Well, Charles Peirce's response was, yes, of course it's anthropomorphizing, because that's what people do. That doesn't invalidate it. That means that you are seeing purpose precisely in those characteristics of participation and purpose and value that are an intrinsic part of what it means to be a human being. That doesn't. Why is that? Why is that in? There's no reason why that would invalidate it, because it merely points up how we know we function on a day-to-day basis. Now, to the point about weak teleology, I don't have a problem with weak teleology per se. What I have a problem with is when you engage in teleological language to the exclusion of all others, and you insist that that must be the narrow guide by which all science proceeds. When you define science as defined by weak teleology and weak teleology alone, that's when I start having problems, because then, that's really a metaphysical position. So you're not talking about science anymore. Now you're talking about metaphysics. That's a different question. And my problem with so many of the, well, for want of a better phrase, call them biological reductionists, like Dawkins and some of the others, that is that you are redefining science in a very narrow and a very specific way. And in fact, to me, you're subscribing to a form of scientism, which is different from science. Science is wonderful. Science does important things, don't we know? And we just saw science in action with the recent COVID epidemic and all the rest, and how we sought to deal with that scientifically. There's nothing wrong with science, but when science becomes an overarching way of receiving and expressing knowledge, in other words, when it becomes a form of, the philosophers would call it a form of epistemic monism. In other words, this way of knowing is science, that science can ultimately explain everything, and that all phenomenon in this world can explain by science. And in those areas where it can't, well, we'll just give you a promissory note for future inquiry and discovery. Well, then that gets to be problematic. Now, the twin of scientism is methodological naturalism, and that's the notion that scientists must invoke only natural processes functioning via unbroken natural laws in non-teleological ways. Now, as a scientist, there's nothing inherently wrong with giving naturalistic explanations for things. That's what we want to do. But I don't know that we can go from that and say that science can explain everything. I don't know that we've found a good scientific explanation for beauty, for love, for the numinous, for the religious impulse, for abstract reasoning, which was what Wallace brought up years ago, music, art, all of those things. All efforts at reductionist explanation, I think, have either proven inadequate or flawed. So I don't see where science can really be, or that we even want science in those terms. We want science to be science and not spill over, as Michael Roos and Daniel Dennett and some of the others do, and spill over into metaphysics. Because that's, I believe it's Rupert Sheldrake says that science should be a method, not a belief system. And I think that's kind of true. And we should know when we're talking metaphysics, and we should know when we're talking science. And when we start having these, shall we say, boundary incursions into other areas, like religion and metaphysics and philosophy and so forth, purporting to be science, that's when we run into trouble. I think it's not just biologists that have done this. I mean, Stephen Hawking has done it. Neil deGrasse Tyson has done it. It's common in physics. And I think, your whole series is about, in a sense, saving science from itself. And I think in part that's kind of what's being talked about, but it's best when it knows its own limits.
Yeah, and this notion that science is somehow gone beyond philosophy is just kind of whistling in the graveyard. I think there's simply no way of talking about science except as a philosophical position about the nature of the world and the nature of nature. But this whole conflict between Wallace and Darwin, for example. Jessica Riskin, in her book *The Restless Clock*, has delved into this problem very deeply in some kind of interesting ways, and you even see it in some of the more physical sciences. You mentioned Stephen Hawking and whatnot, and the problem is that it boils down to the question: is life something that's unique from non-life? And you have answers to that all the way from no, there's no difference, to Leibniz, who says that the entire universe is a product of mind, for example, to the other extreme, which is like the classical Darwinian idea that no, we must abolish mind from our thinking at all. And if it's not possible to have a scientific approach to the problem of mind and cognition, is it possible to even have a science of biology then, or even to have a science of evolution? This is something that it doesn't quite keep me awake at nights, but it is something that I wonder. I call myself a biologist. Is it possible for me to call myself a biological scientist?
Well, that gets you into some very deep philosophical wells, one
Yes.
of which was resolved, at least to my way of thinking. And this can get really complicated because it gets into certain language forms and so forth. But Alfred North Whitehead certainly was an evolutionary philosopher who was also a process philosopher, who had a very different view of mind, who didn't see them as, he saw the world more in terms of wholeness and of everything in terms of flux and change, which is the very epitome of evolution, of being as becoming. And Whitehead might be one that might help you get some sleep. And he would say, you can have biological events, but those are all interwoven into a larger whole of flux and change into becoming. That we don't need to think of these as compartmentalized. I have to say this because if I don't get a chance while I'm talking to you, I have to say the one thing I thought of. You shared with me a paper, Scott, do species want to evolve? And I thought it was a very interesting paper, particularly insofar as how you talked about superorganisms and how they developed. And you had worked in some Aristotelian notions there. And I know we're not here to talk about your work, but one thing I thought of was it reminded me of Darcy Wentworth Thompson,
Mhm.
who was the Scottish morphologist. You probably know who I'm talking about, who was very
Mhm.
Aristotelian, who
Yeah.
wrote On Growth and Form. That seemed to cry out to me. I almost felt like at times I was reading Thompson there, that
Mhm.
yours was a much more, sort of an updated form, because for him, ends and values emerged spontaneously from the world without natural selection, uh, because it was an eliminative factor anyway,
Mhm.
but it wasn't a builder, it was a subtractor. And he saw the world and everything in it as having imminent teleological significance. And
Mhm.
maybe that's where we, need more of this kind of thinking. Again, there have been a lot of proponents of precisely your thesis, and really mine too, that there is some unique properties to life that we can't treat them in a reductionist manner. The problem is these voices just haven't been heard, and they're ruled out of court as being unscientific. So
Well, this is one of the things that keeps me awake at night. It's it's only partly the kind of philosophical conundrum of whether there can actually be a science of biology unless we introduce concepts of mind which are sort of considered out of bounds in the modern materialist way of approaching science. But there's a cultural dimension to it as well, and we all know that the Darwinian materialist idea is dominant in our culture right now. And among the consequences of that is we don't hear about interesting people like Darcy Thompson or Henri Bergson or any of the other vitalist philosophers that were making the very, very same point. And even people like Claude Bernard, for example, who is now touted as a great experimental biologist, implying that he was a reductionist biologist. He was a great experimental biologist, but he was a vitalist, and that sort of aspect of his thinking is just completely submerged, because vitalism, like teleology is the T word, vitalism is kind of the V word. It's not to be admitted into scientific discourse, whatever that is. And of course, when you place that kind of rule, you're basically submerging all of thinking about life all the way back to Aristotle, and it just seems like a very impoverishing way to think about it. But culturally, let's face it, Darwinism is dominant these days.
And I wonder, as a historian, when I was first getting into this research some years ago, and I was re-examining Wallace and juxtaposing him with Darwin, and then looking at how Darwin became such a preeminent figure in the field, I kept asking myself, well, how did we come to this? How did we get in this situation? And the only thing I can say is this. I think that there is, your typical biology textbook, I think, would portray the neo-Darwinian synthesis and Darwin himself basically as science, period. But I think what it really is a form of philosophy known as positivism. Now, historically, positivism has had two iterations. The first was presented by its founder, Auguste Comte, who wrote a massive 6-volume work from the 1830 to about 1840 or 42, I think it was. And then that was condensed and translated, who was Erasmus, Darwin's brother, Erasmus Darwin,
Mm-hmm.
his live-in companion, Harriet Martineau,
Yeah.
Uh,
one of many living companions, apparently. But
yes,
anyways,
well, that's one of his more illustrious living companions.
yeah.
Harriet Martineau translated the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte and gave that to the English-speaking world in 1853. And that may have been the version that Darwin himself read, because I don't think Darwin was fluent in French. At any rate, there is no doubt that Darwin was tremendously influenced by the Comtean perspective. And if you question that, all I could say is go to his published notebooks to Auguste Comte. And Comte believed that history flowed in three distinct phases. One was the basically said was superstition, which was what he called a, quote, fiction of abstractions. And then finally, science guided by rational investigation and inquiry, theology, and competence. That system was based on two: hard verificationism. If you couldn't verify it, it wasn't true. Secondly, a rejection of all metaphysical systems and statements as fundamentally meaningless. Now, those two positions have been pretty difficult to defend. And so positivism sort of fell out of favor. And then only to be resurrected in the 1920s and 30s by the Vienna Circle, which was started by Moritz Schlick and Mach and some others, that tried to use modern mathematics and physics to sort of resurrect these positivist ideas. But we really look at the Vienna Circle and look at their writings and what they were talking about. Philosophically, they're indistinguishable from their French predecessors. The point is, you won't find very few logical positivists today. And the reason for that is hard verificationism and the rejection of all metaphysics is pretty hard, if not impossible, to defend. Full system, if you want to call it that, under the neo-Darwinian synthesis that is premised on precisely those basic positivist tenets. Yes. And I don't think we're not going to proceed until we get past that. The ghost of Auguste Comte haunts Darwinian synthesis ever proposed.
Yeah. The gods of the internet are not being kind to our connection here, and I apologize to the listeners. It does catch up with what you're saying, Michael, but it's like you're being pumped through a space warp of some kind. So I think why don't we go to the question. I think as we start going into the questions, we have one question right now, which sort of from George Seaver. I hope you're still here, George. The question is, what is teleology? Which is really a very difficult question, and I'm just going to give my take on it, and then Michael, you can jump in. So teleology is the basic notion that nature is governed by end goals, by seeking some kind of form or some kind of end state, and among the things that modern Darwinism has done, and perhaps that can be the point of our conversation, is to try to generate various kinds of weak teleologies, and I include things like some of the metaphors for natural selection, like the ecological niche, or hyperdimensional adaptive states, the various kinds of words that are used to sort of hide what's really going on, teleonomy, teleomatic, all kinds of other little weasel words that are in there to basically try to avoid using the idea that life is motivated by pursuit of end states. And that's my take on it. Mike, what do you
Yeah,
have to say about that?
I think that's a good description. I would say, just to add to that most teleological descriptions involve in order to statements.
Mm-hmm.
So that when you're reading or you see something that, birds fly south in order to, well, that's teleology. Now, again, that could be weak teleology. That doesn't necessarily have to be strong, but the term is actually rooted in telos in Greek, meaning end or goal. So these are end, or as you said, end or goal related statements. It's ancient. It goes back at least as far back as Anaxagoras. You can persist. Teleology was just ever present, and it really wasn't until Darwin that teleology became sort of verboten in the field of science. Two of the most notable contemporaries of Darwin, John Herschel and William Whewell, both believed in teleology. And I think it was John Herschel, when he first read Darwin's Origin of Species, called natural selection the law of higgledy-piggledy. Because what he was pointing to is you can't have a law that is devoid of purpose, devoid of an end goal. And so really that's supposedly the new revolution that Darwin introduced into science, and it's been a problem ever since.
Yeah, and I think that the Darwin himself was I think keenly aware of these kinds of contradictions. If you look at his theory of pangenesis, for example, that's a very purpose-driven kind of a way of dealing with the inheritance of adaptation, which at root is a purposeful phenomenon. It's just in the early 20th century that when Darwinism was taken over by these radical positivists and reductionists that imposed really kind of a narrow definition of what science is, and everything else is not science, then I think you run into some problems there. And in your paper on From Plato to Polygyny, you outline some really fascinating historical examples. For example, we often talk about the eclipse of Darwinism, and we're mainly influenced by Peter Bowler, who is a very fine historian of science. But you made the point in that paper, I believe, that when you look at the eclipse of Darwinism, this is really kind of a propaganda rewriting of history by these positivists and reductionists that prevailed in the in the early 20th century, which I thought was an interesting perspective on that.
Well, it's an ongoing argument amongst historians about how pervasive that eclipse really was. I think my personal view is that it was largely, I'm not saying there was no eclipse. I'm saying if there is one, it was surely exaggerated. And I think it was largely promoted by Julian Huxley, who was intimately involved in the creation of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, and of course, Ernst Mayr, who was also part of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. And they wanted to portray a scenario of where Darwinian evolution was receding in significance and importance and might have died out, but for the fact that it was rescued by these Neo-Darwinian synthesizers who, like the cavalry rushing in, rescued Darwin at the last moment by bringing in Mendelian genetics and so forth. The reason I question that is a couple of reasons. Ron Amundsen, who's also a good historian who has written extensively on what he calls the Neo-Darwinian history, he believes more or less concocted the eclipse. But then I also discovered that Robert Broom, the famous anthropologist and archaeologist from South Africa, said he attended the zoological section on at the British Association in 1931, and most people there were committed Darwinists. Well, 1931 was before the Neo-Darwinian synthesis.
Yeah.
Well, if it wasn't dying out in 31, it wasn't dying out at all.
Yeah.
So I just, I can see why one of the biggest promoters, of course, of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis idea has been the historian Peter Bowler, who's a good historian, but I just happen to think it's overextended a bit. If I might add one point about Darwin, I think Darwin became a little confused about teleology himself. And the reason I think he became a little confused is if you look at his opening chapter in Origin of the Species, he decides to present his theory by using breeding examples of pigeons and so forth. He uses an artificial selection model as an analogy for natural selection. And I think that was problematic from the beginning. And when Darwin first proposed this, Wallace never thought that in fact, that was one of the reasons for his letter, which was on the tendency of varieties to depart from their original type. He said, look, if you're going to use this as, that's unnatural selection, because the breeders it's guided selection if there ever was guided selection.
Yes.
And John Duns, I don't know if John Duns was the Edinburgh New College professor of natural science, who, when he first heard Darwin's theory, told Darwin, he said, no, and he had been a breeder, professional breeder, for over 20 years. And he says, crossbreeding and all that actually occurs under the watchful and discriminating intelligence of well-schooled breeders.
Yes.
And he said, this is not an analogy with any kind of natural selection you could envision. And Darwin's reply was just to say, well, that was a clever response. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But of course,
I think Darwin got off on the wrong foot, and I think that problem vexed him from beginning to end.
Yeah, and the whole issue of adaptation and natural selection, which was George Williams' big thing. I pointed out several times that one of the consequences of the genetical theory of natural selection was that it robbed Darwinism of a coherent theory of adaptation, which to Darwin himself, that's what natural selection, the struggle for existence, was all about. How well adapted versus poorly adapted organisms are to their environments, and one of the consequences of turning this into a theory of gene selection rather than adaptation was to take away one of the fundamental properties of living things. And so I see we have George Siever still with us. I'm pleased. Sorry, Mike, what were you going to say?
I think that's a very good point, and I think even Darwin's pangenesis theory, if I'm not mistaken, could be considered neo-Lamarckian.
Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely. The whole pangenesis idea, and getting into the historical issues. I read fairly extensively on the different kinds of evolutionary theories that were present at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and so forth. And it was an incredibly rich period of evolutionary thought, and it's just sort of, flushed down the memory hole by the modern way that we talk about evolution. But back to George Siever, he elaborates on his question. He says, I reference evolution to provide transcendent concepts in support of current successful human behavior, as opposed to some current arbitrary theories. Is teleology consistent with this? I would say yes, it is, because teleology is itself a kind of a transcendent concept. But Mike, what do you say?
I would agree. I didn't hear anything in that. Mm-hmm. Read it again one more time.
Sure. It's on the Q&A box, but he says, I reference evolution to provide
I see it.
Transcendent concepts in support of current successful human behavior, close parenthesis, as opposed to some current arbitrary theories. And by arbitrary, I'm presuming that George means the kind of materialist, reductionist kind of thing. Right. Is teleology consistent with this? And I would say absolutely yes, because teleology itself is a kind of transcendent concept.
Right. So, I would agree. Yeah. Transcendence as opposed to reductionist, whereas you talk about the mind being epiphenomenon of the brain, that kind of thing. Well, our mind is nothing more than our neural synapse. Teleology would fit into
thought. Thought is a secretion of the brain, in the way that some people phrase it. But then
that's what.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I missed what you said. Okay, I think
there was a little glitch there.
Yes. Yeah. So, and maybe it is a secretion, but what kind of secretion is it? But of course, the danger on the other side is you get into this Leibnizian concept that everything is a product of mind, and then we run into the problem of defining life from the other direction. If life is mind in a universe that is not generally ruled by mind, how do you distinguish life? And again, if everything in the universe is ruled by mind, how is life any different from the rest of the material universe? And again, we come back to my problem: can there be a science of life and of evolution? Okay, Mike, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm going to propose that we say good night to everyone. I really enjoyed our discussion, Mike,
Okay.
and I know you have a new book coming out about some of these process philosophers that you mentioned throughout our conversation tonight, including Charles Peirce and
Yeah.
Boudin. I hope to see a book coming out. Yes, John Boudin. I hope to see a book coming out on that very soon, and I wish you good luck with that. And let me just mention to the audience that
Thank
our
you.
next. Let me just mention that our next Restoring the Sciences seminar will be in 2 weeks. We'll have as our guest John Legates, who was the state climatologist of Delaware, and he's going to tell us about some of his experiences in trying to be a scientist in a political body. And George Seaver says, thanks. Glad we could answer your question, George, and thank you for attending. And so with that, I will say good night, good day to everyone, and I hope to see you next week. And Michael, again, thank you very much for tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Scott, and thank the audience. And it was a pleasure to participate.
Yes.